I think it's important to remember that the Middle East is only one theater where the U.S. is active. Will follow the Nakura framework in terms of model, which is to say that you will have both parties hosted by UNIFIL. So the Israelis and the Lebanese will be hosted by the UN at their base in Naura, with the difference that the US government will be present as well as mediator. This is a significant change in format. The Israelis and the Lebanese are very familiar at this point, years into the tripartite framework between UNIFIL, the IDF, and the LAF. But having, in addition to that structure in terms of a moderator, in this case the United States, and also the presence of other officials, both from Israel and Lebanon in their professional capacity, it's a unique structure. Like a key stumbling block for the last decade, if not longer, was this idea that there were parties in Lebanon, especially Amal and Hezbollah, Shia parties, who thought that if there was going to be some kind of a mediation on the maritime dispute, the view by both parties was that the UN should play a dual role, both as a host and as a moderator to discussions. This was a non-starter for the Israelis. It was not viewed as particularly a credible approach by some other third parties. There were successive US governments that thought that blockage was counterproductive and by design. On August 4th, as you mentioned, there was an explosion in Beirut. It was made clear to me through contacts in Beirut around August 6th that at the level of the Amal movement of Speaker Berry, that blockage on the issue of the UN as a moderator evaporated somewhat fortuitously. It's a euphemism to say that when you speak of the Amal movement, you're also speaking of the larger consensus that brings in Hezbollah. There would not be a shift towards accepting the US as the sole moderator by Speaker Berry and by Amal, were there not a implicit, if not explicit, level of support from Hezbollah on the issue. The drivers to this are an overlap of domestic and external factors that by now most followers of the Middle East are familiar with. You have a trend that is difficult to reverse for parties like Hezbollah and Amal, which is that this collective set of issues and how they are handled or mishandled by authorities is by direct line of sight or indirectly pinned on them in terms of ultimate blame as the two parties that are the most preponderant, both in government in terms of actual office, but also in terms of influence tied to government and governance in Lebanon. So the experiment of post-war governance and its failure was being blamed largely on Hezbollah and Amal. And that trend is a difficult trend to reverse. In some ways it means nothing, and in other ways it's critical. There is an agreement to have a conversation, and there's an agreement on what that conversation should look like. This is an agreement on the format. That's how divisive all of this is. You have to first even try to agree what the shape of the table is supposed to be on the conversation. So I'm not holding my breath that any of this will be easy, but I also don't look at this as just some minor blip in Lebanon's post-war history. It's not a coincidence that after a maelstrom of domestic and international pressures, Lebanon's two leading Shiite political parties basically, reversed course and said, "Yeah, let's push on with these discussions." I think it's important to remember that the Middle East is only one theater where the U.S. is active. The U.S. government has done a few things tied to Lebanon and tied to this maritime dispute that have moved the ball along. But it's not clear that that is the result of a defined strategy, but more the outcome of tactics that lead to strategic openings and opportunities. The persistent use of sanctions in 2020, but also the use of sanctions more effectively in the last few months have been critical. So things like delineating the maritime border, having those conversations, opening up for future conversations on the land border, and just getting a bit more upfront about the fact that state of war is not a perpetual hobby of either Israel or Lebanon. Those are all net positives for stability in a region at a time when you have far too much strategic competition by regional states as a byproduct of the U.S. having to deal with a global set of challenges.